When my mother dismissed my concerns about my stepfather's behavior as me being too sensitive, I questioned myself for months. When the judge granted my emergency restraining order based on documented evidence of his escalating threats, suddenly, I wasn't sensitive enough. Sometimes protecting yourself means accepting that the people who should believe you simply won't, until a court order forces them to take you seriously. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Cassandra Mitchell, and for 26 years, I believed my mother when she told me I was too emotional, too dramatic, too sensitive. It took a stack of police reports and a family court judge to prove that my instincts had been protecting me all along. But before I tell you how a family dinner turned into a legal nightmare that split our household in half, you need to understand the foundation that cracked long before anyone noticed the damage. Growing up in Riverside, California, I was the kind of child who noticed everything. When adults whispered in hallways, I heard the tension beneath their words. When my mother's smile didn't reach her eyes after phone calls with her sister, I felt the weight of whatever news had been delivered. My father used to call it emotional intelligence, back when he was still alive, to defend my sensitivity as a strength rather than a character flaw. The house on Maple Street had been our sanctuary for 18 years before everything changed. My father, Robert Mitchell, had bought it when I was 8 years old, a modest 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and enough bedrooms for the family he and my mother, Linda, had planned to grow. Cancer had other plans. By the time I turned 21, it was just my mother and me rattling around in rooms that still smelled like his cologne and echoed with conversations that would never happen again. Linda Mitchell had been a devoted wife. For 23 years, the kind of woman who packed elaborate lunches for business trips and remembered the birthdays of her husband's co-workers' children. After Robert's death, she seemed to shrink into herself, spending entire weekends in her bathrobe, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours earlier while staring at photo albums she never quite managed to close. I understood her grief intimately because it mirrored my own. But what I didn't understand was how desperate that grief had made her for any kind of companionship that might fill the silence. Derek Hoffman entered our lives 18 months after my father's funeral, introduced by my mother's co-worker as a recently divorced contractor who might be able to fix the leaking roof that had been dripping into buckets all winter. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, driving a white pickup truck with tools scattered across the bed and a confident smile that made my mother blush for the first time since before my father's diagnosis. At 48, Derek was younger than my mother by 6 years, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from decades of outdoor work. His dark hair was graying at the temples, his hands were permanently stained with evidence of his trade, and he had a way of filling up whatever room he entered with stories about job sites and difficult clients that made my mother laugh in a way I'd forgotten she was capable of. Within 2 weeks, he wasn't just fixing our roof anymore. He was staying for dinner, bringing flowers from the grocery store, and occupying the living room recliner that had been my father's favorite spot. Tried to be supportive because I wanted my mother to be happy. The transformation in her energy was undeniable. She started cooking elaborate meals again, bought new clothes that weren't exclusively black or gray, and began humming while she organized closets that had been neglected since my father's death. Derek seemed to genuinely care about her well-being, remembering details about her work frustrations and surprising her with small gifts that showed he'd been paying attention to her preferences. For the first few months, his presence in our home felt like a healing force that was helping both of us move forward from the darkness that had consumed us for so long. The changes started subtly, the way most dangerous shifts do. Derek began offering opinions about household decisions that had previously been made between my mother and me. When I suggested we finally donate my father's clothes to charity, Derek interjected that my mother wasn't ready for such a big step, despite her having mentioned the same idea several times over the previous weeks. When I brought home groceries from a different store because they had better prices on organic produce, Derek questioned why I was wasting money on expensive food when perfectly good options were available at the discount chain where he shopped. These moments felt awkward rather than alarming at first. I attributed them to the natural adjustment period that comes when three adults try to navigate shared living space and decision-making responsibilities. Derek was trying to establish his place in our household dynamic, and I was still figuring out how to relate to this man who was becoming increasingly important to my mother. The fact that his suggestions often contradicted my preferences seemed like a minor incompatibility rather than a pattern worth analyzing. By autumn, Derek had moved most of his belongings into my mother's bedroom and established routines that made it clear he considered himself a permanent resident. He kept his work boots by the front door, monopolized the television remote during dinner, and began referring to household expenses as our money, even though he contributed sporadically, and never in amounts proportional to what he consumed. My mother defended these arrangements by explaining that Derek was between major contracts and couldn't be expected to split bills equally until his financial situation stabilized. The first incident that made me genuinely uncomfortable happened on a Saturday afternoon in October. I'd been organizing my father's home office, boxing up old tax documents and business papers that no longer needed to be kept. Derek wandered in while I was working, ostensibly to ask about borrowing tools from the garage, but instead of leaving after I'd answered his question, he lingered by the desk, picking up framed photos of my father and making comments about the shrine my mother and I were maintaining. "It's not healthy to live in the past like this," he said, setting down a picture of my parents on their wedding day with unnecessary force. "Linda needs to move forward, and keeping all this stuff around isn't helping her heal." I explained that my mother had asked me to organize these materials and that we were only keeping documents with sentimental value or potential tax implications. Derek shook his head with the kind of patronizing expression that suggested he knew better than both of us what was appropriate for our grieving process. He spent the next 20 minutes describing how his ex-wife had clung to mementos from their relationship long after their divorce, drawing parallels that felt both inappropriate and deliberately hurtful. When my mother found us in the office, Derek immediately shifted the conversation to frame himself as trying to help us move forward in a healthy way. He told her that holding on to so many reminders of my father might be preventing her from embracing the new chapter they were building together. My mother looked uncomfortable, but didn't contradict him. And when I tried to explain that organizing these papers was actually helping me process my grief, Derek dismissed my perspective as the reaction of someone who wasn't ready to accept change. That evening, my mother approached me privately to suggest that maybe Derek had a point about not dwelling on the past. She couched it in language about healing and growth, but the underlying message was clear. My ongoing connection to my father's memory was somehow problematic for her relationship with Derek. This conversation marked the beginning of a dynamic where Derek's comfort became the primary consideration in household decisions, even when those decisions involved my father's belongings or my own emotional well-being. The pattern escalated throughout the winter months. Derek began commenting on my appearance, suggesting that I dressed too formally for casual family dinners or too casually for family gatherings. He offered unsolicited advice about my career choices, questioning why someone with a college degree was working as a freelance graphic designer instead of pursuing a real job with benefits and stability. When I explained that freelancing gave me flexibility and creative fulfillment, he responded with skeptical expressions and comments about young people not understanding the value of security. These interactions always happened when my mother was present, and they always concluded with Derek turning to her for validation of his perspectives. My mother, eager to maintain harmony in her new relationship, typically offered neutral responses that didn't challenge Derek's opinions, but also didn't explicitly support them. Her silence in these moments felt like abandonment, even though I understood intellectually that she was trying to navigate an impossible situation between her daughter and her boyfriend. The dynamic became more concerning when Derek started involving himself in conversations between my mother and me, interjecting corrections or alternative viewpoints even when the topics didn't concern him directly. If I mentioned feeling stressed about a work deadline, Derek would explain that my stress was probably due to poor time management, rather than a genuinely challenging situation. If I expressed frustration about a friend's behavior, Derek would suggest that maybe I was being too judgmental and should consider how my own actions might have contributed to the conflict. These interventions were always presented as helpful, guidance from someone with more life experience, but they had the cumulative effect of making me question my own perceptions and emotional responses. When I tried to discuss this pattern with my mother, she explained that Derek was just trying to help, and that his input came from a place of caring rather than criticism. She suggested that I might be interpreting his comments more negatively than he intended because I was still adjusting to having another adult voice in our household decisions. By spring, I'd begun documenting these interactions in a journal, not because I planned to take any action based on what I was recording, but because I needed some way to process the confusion I felt about whether my discomfort was justified. Reading back, through months of entries revealed patterns that were difficult to dismiss as misunderstandings or adjustment difficulties. Derek consistently positioned himself as an authority figure whose opinions should supersede mine, even in matters directly related to my personal life or professional choices. The first time Derek raised his voice at me happened during a Sunday dinner in April. I'd prepared a meal featuring several dishes my father had particularly enjoyed, partly out of nostalgia, but mostly because they were recipes I'd been wanting to perfect. Derek made several comments throughout the meal about the food being too fancy for a casual dinner, and questioned why I'd spent so much time cooking when simpler options would have been more practical. When I mentioned that cooking elaborate meals was something I found relaxing and that these particular recipes had sentimental value, Derek's tone shifted dramatically. He told me that constantly bringing up my father during family meals was inappropriate, and that my inability to move forward was affecting my mother's healing process. His voice carried an edge of anger that hadn't been present in his previous criticisms, and his words felt deliberately designed to hurt rather than help. My mother intervened to calm the situation, but instead of addressing Derek's inappropriate tone or hurtful comments, she focused on smoothing over the conflict by suggesting we avoid topics that might be emotionally charged. The implication was that my grief and my connection to my father's memory were problems to be managed rather than natural responses that deserved respect and space within our family dynamic. That night, I realized that Derek wasn't just uncomfortable with my presence in the household. He was actively working to diminish my influence and emotional significance in my mother's life. The recognition that this was happening deliberately rather than accidentally changed everything about how I understood our interactions and what they meant for my future safety in my own home. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The months following that explosive dinner revealed layers of manipulation I hadn't recognized while they were being constructed around me. Derek's strategies became more sophisticated as he grew confident that my mother would prioritize their relationship over my concerns. What had started as subtle criticisms evolved into systematic campaigns designed to isolate me from my own support systems and undermine my credibility within our household. My childhood friend Rebecca Martinez had been my closest confidant since elementary school, someone who knew my family dynamics intimately and could offer perspective on situations I was too close to evaluate objectively. When I started sharing my concerns about Derek's behavior during our weekly coffee meetings, Rebecca immediately recognized patterns that reminded her of her own mother's abusive second marriage. She encouraged me to trust my instincts and suggested that Derek's behavior toward me wasn't normal step-family adjustment, but deliberate emotional manipulation. Derek somehow learned about these conversations, though I never determined whether my mother had mentioned them or if he'd overheard phone calls I thought were private. During a family barbecue in May, Derek made pointed comments about Rebecca's influence on my perspective, describing her as someone who thrived on drama and encouraged others to create problems where none existed. He told elaborate stories about Friends whose relationships had been sabotaged by toxic confidants who couldn't stand to see others happy. The message was unmistakable. My friendship with Rebecca was problematic for our family harmony, and continuing to seek her advice would be viewed as disloyalty to my mother's happiness. When I defended Rebecca's character and explained that our friendship provided valuable emotional support, Derek responded with patronizing observations about young women who couldn't solve their own problems without outside interference. My mother sat silently through this character assassination, occasionally nodding when Derek made particularly cutting remarks about the dangers of friends who gave unsolicited relationship advice. Work became Derek's next target for intervention and control. My freelance graphic design business had been thriving for 3 years, providing steady income and creative fulfillment, while allowing me the flexibility to help my mother through her grief and adjustment period. I worked primarily with small businesses and nonprofit organizations, creating marketing materials and brand identities that reflected their values and connected with their target audiences. The work was meaningful to me because it combined artistic expression with practical problem solving, and my clients consistently praised both my creative vision and professional reliability. Derek began questioning the legitimacy of freelance work during dinner conversations, describing it as an unstable career choice that prevented me from building real financial security. He shared stories about contractors he knew who'd tried to work independently, but eventually returned to traditional employment because self-employment was too risky and unpredictable. These conversations always occurred when potential clients might call, or when I was working on deadline-sensitive projects, creating stress and distraction that affected my ability to focus on professional responsibilities. When I explained that my business was actually quite stable and profitable, Derek would demand specific financial details that felt invasive and inappropriate. He wanted to know my exact monthly earnings, how much I charged different clients, and whether I was saving adequately for retirement and emergencies. These interrogations were framed as concerned guidance from someone who understood business, realities better than I did, but they felt more like attempts to gather information that could later be used to undermine my confidence or credibility. My mother supported Derek's intrusions by expressing worry about my long-term financial stability and suggesting that maybe I should consider applying for traditional jobs with benefits and predictable schedules. She'd never questioned my career choices before Derek's arrival, and her sudden concern felt manufactured rather than genuine. When I reminded her that freelancing had allowed me to be available during my father's illness and her subsequent grief, she dismissed those considerations as temporary circumstances that shouldn't influence permanent career decisions. The physical boundaries in our shared living space became another battleground where Derek systematically expanded his territory while restricting mine. He moved his tools and equipment into the garage where my father's workshop had been, claiming he needed storage space for legitimate work purposes. Gradually, those tools spread throughout the house, appearing in the basement, on kitchen counters, and even in living room corners where they disrupted the aesthetic my mother had carefully maintained for decades. When I asked Derek to contain his belongings to designated areas, he responded with lectures about sharing space in multi-generational households and suggested that my attachment to keeping common areas organized reflected an unrealistic expectation that the house should remain a museum to my father's preferences. My mother agreed that we all needed to be more flexible about how space was used, even though Derek's definition of flexibility only seemed to require accommodation from me rather than mutual compromise. Derek began entering my bedroom without permission, ostensibly to check windows or examine walls related to home improvement projects he claimed my mother had authorized. These intrusions always happened when my mother wasn't home, and they always included comments about my belongings, decorating choices, or housekeeping standards that made me feel violated and unsafe in my own private space. When I installed a lock on my bedroom door, Derek complained to my mother that I was being paranoid and creating unnecessary barriers to his ability to maintain the house properly. The financial dynamics in our household shifted dramatically as Derek consolidated control over expenses and decision-making processes. He convinced my mother to add his name to her checking account, explaining that sharing finances would demonstrate trust and commitment in their relationship. Once he had access to her money, Derek began making unilateral decisions about expenditures that affected the entire household, including canceling services I used regularly and changing utility providers without consulting anyone about the impacts of those switches. When the internet service Derek selected proved inadequate for my work requirements, he dismissed my complaints as evidence that I was too demanding and inflexible. He suggested that if I needed better internet for business purposes, I should pay for a separate connection, rather than expecting the household to accommodate my professional needs. This logic conveniently ignored the fact that I'd been paying a portion of household expenses for years and had never requested special accommodations before his arbitrary changes disrupted services that had been working perfectly well. Derek's control extended to social situations where he monitored and managed my interactions with extended family members and family friends. During my Aunt Patricia's birthday celebration in June, Derek positioned himself between me and other guests, steering conversations away from topics where I might share perspectives that contradicted his narratives about our household harmony. When my cousin Jennifer asked about my work projects, Derek interrupted to describe the challenges of supporting someone whose income was unpredictable, framing his commentary as good-natured teasing while actually undermining my professional credibility in front of family members. These social manipulations were particularly insidious because they occurred in public settings where confronting Derek's behavior would have seemed disproportionate and dramatic. He'd mastered the art of delivering cutting remarks with enough humor and charm that challenging him would make me appear oversensitive or unable to take a joke. Other family members, unaware of the broader pattern of control and manipulation, interpreted these interactions as normal family dynamics rather than systematic emotional abuse. My mother's role in enabling Derek's behavior became increasingly clear as she began actively participating in campaigns designed to modify my responses and expectations. She started framing Derek's criticisms as helpful feedback that I should appreciate rather than resist, explaining that his input came from experience and wisdom that could benefit my personal growth. When I expressed hurt or anger about Derek's treatment, my mother would minimize my feelings by suggesting that I was overreacting to well-intentioned guidance. The gaslighting became more explicit as Derek and my mother began collaborating on alternative narratives about incidents where Derek's behavior had been clearly inappropriate. They would claim that I'd misunderstood his tone, misremembered the sequence of events, or misinterpreted his intentions in ways that painted me as unreliable and emotionally unstable. These revisions of reality were presented as gentle corrections, rather than deliberate distortions, making it difficult to argue against them without seeming defensive or irrational. My sleep patterns deteriorated as the stress of constant vigilance and conflict took its toll on my physical and mental health. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying conversations and analyzing Derek's behavior for signs of escalation or new forms of manipulation. The hyper-awareness that had once been an asset in recognizing subtle emotional dynamics became exhausting when applied to monitoring potential threats in my own home environment. Derek noticed my fatigue and used it as evidence that my lifestyle choices were unhealthy and unsustainable. He suggested that my work schedule was too demanding, my social commitments were too numerous, and my emotional reactions were too intense for someone who claimed to be managing her responsibilities effectively. These observations were always delivered as expressions of concern rather than accusations, but they contributed to a growing narrative that I was fundamentally unstable and in need of guidance from more balanced adults. The isolation tactics intensified as Derek worked to damage my relationships with anyone who might offer support or alternative perspectives on our family dynamics. He made disparaging comments about Rebecca's character and judgment, questioned my other friends' motives for maintaining contact with me, and suggested that my professional relationships were superficial connections based on business transactions rather than genuine personal regard. These assessments were designed to make me doubt the validity of external support systems and increase my dependence on his and my mother's approval. When Rebecca invited me to join her book club, Derek expressed skepticism about the group's real purpose, suggesting that it was probably a forum for gossip and complaint rather than intellectual discussion. He wondered aloud whether spending time with women who gathered regularly to criticize their life circumstances might negatively influence my own attitude and perspective. My mother supported his concerns by questioning whether I had enough free time for additional social commitments, given my work responsibilities and household contributions. The cumulative effect of these restrictions and manipulations was to create an environment where I felt constantly monitored, frequently criticized, and increasingly isolated from sources of objective feedback about my experiences. Derek had successfully positioned himself as the authority figure whose opinions carried the most weight in household decisions, while simultaneously undermining my credibility and independence at every opportunity. By midsummer, I realized that the situation had progressed beyond normal family adjustment difficulties into territory that required professional intervention or dramatic personal changes. Derek's behavior wasn't improving with time and communication. It was escalating in sophistication and intensity as he became more confident that my mother would support his authority over my autonomy. The question was no longer whether Derek's treatment was inappropriate, but whether I could survive much longer in an environment designed to slowly erode my sense of reality and self-worth. The breaking point came during a seemingly innocent conversation about holiday plans in July, when Derek announced that he and my mother had decided to spend Christmas with his family in Phoenix rather than maintaining our traditional celebration at home. This decision had been made without consulting me, despite the fact that Christmas had been my father's favorite holiday, and our family traditions held deep emotional significance that extended far beyond mere social preferences. When I expressed disappointment about changing plans that honored my father's memory, Derek responded with familiar accusations about my inability to move forward and my tendency to prioritize past relationships over present family harmony. But this time, his criticism included explicit threats about my continued welcome in what he now referred to as his home. He told me that if I couldn't accept his role as head of the household and support his decisions about family activities, I might need to consider alternative living arrangements that would be more compatible with my attachment to the past. Derek's threat about alternative living arrangements marked a fundamental shift in how I understood my position within what had once been my family home. The implicit message was clear: accept his authority unconditionally or face homelessness. This ultimatum forced me to confront the reality that my mother had chosen her romantic relationship over her daughter's safety and well-being, a betrayal that cut deeper than any of Derek's direct attacks on my character or independence. The week following his housing threat brought a series of escalating incidents that demonstrated Derek's growing confidence in his control over our household dynamics. He began leaving threatening notes in places where only I would find them, tucked inside books I was reading, slipped under my bedroom door, placed on my laptop keyboard when I stepped away from my workspace. These messages weren't explicitly violent, but they contained veiled warnings about the consequences of continued resistance to his leadership and authority within our family structure. One note, written on a torn piece of cardboard and left on my car windshield, simply read, "Smart people know when to stop fighting battles they can't win. Stubborn people learn the hard way." Another, placed inside my work portfolio, contained a single sentence: "Your mother deserves peace in her own home." These communications were calculated to create anxiety and fear while maintaining plausible deniability about their threatening nature if I attempted to share them with others. When I showed the notes to my mother, hoping she would recognize them as evidence of Derek's escalating psychological abuse, she suggested that I might be misinterpreting his attempts to communicate about our ongoing family tensions. She examined each message carefully, and concluded that while Derek's approach might be unconventional, his underlying concerns about household harmony were valid and deserved consideration rather than immediate dismissal as harassment. My mother's response to these written threats revealed the extent to which Derek had successfully manipulated her perception of reality and her understanding of appropriate relationship dynamics. She'd been conditioned to interpret his abusive behavior as passionate commitment to their relationship and protective concern for her emotional well-being. Any evidence that contradicted this narrative was either minimized as misunderstanding or reframed as proof that I was too sensitive to appreciate Derek's good intentions. The gaslighting intensified as Derek began staging incidents designed to make me appear unstable or unreliable when my mother was present to witness my reactions. He would move my belongings and then express concern about my forgetfulness when I couldn't locate items I'd placed in specific locations. He would change appointments I'd made or cancel services I relied upon, then suggest that my memory problems might indicate stress-related cognitive issues that required professional attention. These manufactured crises were particularly insidious because they exploited my mother's genuine worry about my mental health during a period when I was obviously struggling with the trauma of living in a hostile environment. Derek positioned himself as the rational, concerned parent figure who was trying to help an increasingly erratic young adult manage her responsibilities and emotional reactions. My mother, desperate to believe in his good intentions, accepted his interpretations of my behavior rather than questioning the suspicious timing and consistency of these alleged memory lapses. The isolation tactics expanded beyond restricting my relationships with friends and family to include interfering with my professional connections and client relationships. Derek began answering my business phone when I was unavailable, providing misinformation about my availability and reliability to potential clients who called to discuss project opportunities. He would tell callers that I was dealing with personal problems that might affect my ability to meet deadlines or maintain consistent communication throughout project development. When I discovered that Derek had been sabotaging my professional reputation, I confronted him about the inappropriateness of interfering with my livelihood and financial independence. His response was to claim that he'd been trying to protect clients from unrealistic expectations about my capacity to handle work responsibilities while managing family tensions. He suggested that my defensive reaction to his helpful intervention demonstrated exactly the kind of emotional instability that made it necessary for more mature adults to monitor my professional interactions. My mother supported Derek's explanation by expressing concern that I might be taking on too much work during a stressful period, and suggesting that having someone screen my business calls could actually be beneficial for managing my workload and preventing overwhelm. She framed Derek's interference as protective assistance rather than deliberate sabotage, despite the obvious negative impact on my income and professional relationships. The financial control mechanisms became more sophisticated as Derek convinced my mother to consolidate their resources and eliminate what he described as unnecessary duplicate expenses in our household budget. He argued that maintaining separate internet connections, phone services, and streaming subscriptions was wasteful, and that combining these services under his name would save money that could be better allocated to home improvements and shared recreational activities. Once Derek controlled these essential services, he began using them as leverage to modify my behavior and compliance with his household rules. When I violated his expectations about curfews, social activities, or attitude adjustments, he would temporarily suspend my internet access or change passwords for accounts I needed for work purposes. These punishments were presented as natural consequences for disrespectful behavior, rather than deliberate attempts to control my independence and financial stability. The most disturbing escalation involved Derek's increasing physical intimidation, tactics that stopped just short of actual violence while clearly communicating his capacity and willingness to hurt me if I continued challenging his authority. He would position himself between me and exit routes during confrontational conversations, stand uncomfortably close when delivering criticism or ultimatums, and use his significantly larger physical presence to create an atmosphere of threat and vulnerability. During one particularly intense argument about his interference with my work calls, Derek cornered me in the kitchen and spoke in a low, controlled voice that was more terrifying than shouting would have been. He described in detail what would happen to my belongings, my pets, and my sense of security if I forced him to take more dramatic action to protect his relationship with my mother. The threats were specific enough to be credible, but vague enough to avoid explicit criminality if repeated to others. When my mother found us in what appeared to be an ordinary conversation, Derek immediately shifted his tone and body language to project calm reasonableness, while I remained visibly shaken by his implied threats. My mother interpreted my distress as evidence of emotional instability, rather than appropriate fear responses to intimidation, asking me privately later whether I needed professional help managing my anxiety and anger about our changing family dynamics. The medical gaslighting represented a new level of manipulation, as Derek began suggesting that my reactions to his abuse were actually symptoms of mental illness that required intervention and treatment. He researched information about mood disorders, anxiety conditions, and personality disorders that he could reference when describing my behavior to my mother and other family members. This pseudo-professional vocabulary made his assessments sound more credible and scientific than simple opinion or criticism. Derek would cite specific diagnostic criteria he'd found online, explaining that my emotional volatility, social isolation, and conflict with authority figures were consistent with various psychological conditions that would benefit from medication and therapy. He presented these armchair diagnoses as concerned observations rather than manipulative attempts to undermine my credibility and social support systems. My mother embraced Derek's medical interpretations because they provided a framework for understanding my distress that didn't require acknowledging his abusive behavior or questioning her romantic choices. If my problems were caused by mental illness rather than environmental factors, then the solution was individual treatment rather than changes to our household dynamics or Derek's behavior patterns. The documentation I'd been maintaining throughout. Derek's escalation became crucial as I realized that my perceptions and memories were being systematically challenged by two people whose opinions carried significant weight in my social and family networks. The journal entries, photographs of threatening notes, and recordings of conversations provided objective evidence that contradicted Derek and my mother's alternative narratives about my mental state and the nature of our conflicts. Reading through. Months of documented incidents revealed patterns that were impossible to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. Derek's behavior followed predictable cycles of escalation, temporary calm, and renewed aggression that corresponded exactly with external stressors in his relationship with my mother or professional challenges in his construction work. When he felt threatened or insecure in other areas of his life, he would intensify his control and abuse within our household where he felt most powerful. The summer heat seemed to amplify the tension and frequency of Derek's aggressive episodes, leading to daily confrontations about minor infractions of rules that changed without notice or explanation. I was criticized for leaving dishes in the sink for more than an hour, for playing music at volumes that didn't actually disturb anyone else, for receiving phone calls during hours Derek had arbitrarily designated as family time, and for expressing opinions about current events that contradicted his political perspectives. These manufactured conflicts served multiple purposes in Derek's campaign of psychological warfare. They created constant stress that affected my sleep, appetite, and ability to concentrate on work responsibilities. They provided pretexts for punishment and restriction of privileges I'd previously taken for granted. Most importantly, they established a pattern of daily discord that made my presence in the household appear to be the source of family tension rather than Derek's abusive behavior. My mother's participation in these dynamics became increasingly active as she began initiating conversations about my attitude, behavior, and contribution to household harmony without prompting from Derek. She would express disappointment about my inability to appreciate Derek's efforts to include me in family activities, question my motives for resisting his guidance and suggestions, and compare my current behavior unfavorably to my previous cooperative and respectful demeanor. These maternal criticisms were particularly devastating because they represented the complete erosion of the parent-child relationship that had provided stability and support throughout my life. My mother, who had once been my fiercest advocate and protector, had become an active participant in campaigns designed to break down my sense of reality and self-worth. The woman who had raised me to trust my instincts and stand up for my values was now demanding that I suppress those same qualities to accommodate an abusive man's need for control. The breaking point arrived during a family barbecue in August, when Derek's behavior toward me crossed lines that even our guests couldn't ignore or rationalize as normal family dynamics. My Aunt Patricia and cousin Jennifer were visiting for the weekend, providing the first opportunity in months for extended family members to observe our household interactions without Derek's careful management of public presentations. Derek had been drinking steadily throughout the afternoon, and his usual veneer of charm and reasonableness began slipping as alcohol lowered his inhibitions and amplified his underlying hostility toward my presence. When I volunteered to help serve dessert, Derek loudly announced that I shouldn't be trusted with kitchen responsibilities because I was too careless and emotional to handle tasks that required attention to detail and consideration for others. The "out" comment was so inappropriate and disproportionate to the situation that both Patricia and Jennifer looked shocked and uncomfortable. When I tried to address Derek's characterization of my abilities, he escalated to personal attacks about my work ethic, my contribution to household expenses, and my ungrateful attitude toward his generous acceptance of my continued residence in what he now openly referred to as his home. My mother, instead of defending me against these public humiliations, attempted to smooth over the situation by acknowledging that there had been tension and suggesting that everyone was probably feeling stressed by the heat and social pressure. Her response normalized Derek's abusive behavior and implied that I bore equal responsibility for the conflict, despite having done nothing more than offer to help with hosting duties. Patricia took me aside later that evening and directly asked whether I felt safe living with Derek, expressing concern about the dynamic she'd witnessed and the obvious changes in my demeanor since his arrival in our family. Her questions forced me to articulate fears and observations I'd been minimizing and rationalizing for months, and her validation of my perceptions provided the external reality check I desperately needed to begin taking protective action. Patricia's validation shattered the carefully constructed reality that Derek and my mother had been building around my perceptions and experiences. For the first time in months, someone I trusted was confirming that the situation I'd been living through wasn't normal family adjustment or evidence of my own emotional instability. Her concern gave me permission to stop minimizing Derek's behavior and start recognizing it as the systematic abuse it had always been. The conversation with my aunt took place on her hotel balcony, away from Derek's monitoring and my mother's interference. Patricia had always been the most perceptive member of our extended family, someone who noticed subtleties that others missed and wasn't afraid to address uncomfortable truths when family dynamics became unhealthy or destructive. Her direct questions about my safety forced me to articulate fears I'd been suppressing and acknowledge realities I'd been avoiding. When I described the pattern of threats, intimidation, and manipulation that had escalated throughout Derek's residence in our home, Patricia listened without interruption or judgment. She didn't suggest that I might be overreacting or misunderstanding his intentions, responses I'd grown accustomed to receiving from my mother and other family members who preferred to avoid acknowledging the existence of abuse within our supposedly functional household. Patricia's professional background as a social worker provided her with frameworks for understanding abusive relationship dynamics that I lacked despite my personal experience of living through them. She explained how psychological abuse often follows predictable patterns of isolation, control, and reality distortion that are designed to make victims question their own perceptions while increasing their dependence on abusive partners or family. members for validation and support. Her expertise helped me understand that Derek's behavior wasn't random cruelty or poor communication skills, but calculated strategies intended to break down my resistance to his authority and eliminate my ability to seek help or escape his control. This knowledge was simultaneously validating and terrifying, confirming my worst suspicions while revealing the sophisticated nature of the psychological warfare I'd been enduring for nearly 2 years. Patricia urged me to begin documenting Derek's threats and abusive behavior more systematically, not just for my own clarity and validation, but as evidence that might become necessary if the situation continued escalating toward physical violence or legal intervention. She helped me understand that emotional and psychological abuse often serve as precursors to physical assault, and that Derek's increasing boldness in threatening and intimidating me suggested he was testing boundaries before crossing lines that would leave visible evidence of his violence. The week following Patricia's visit brought immediate retaliation from Derek, who had apparently overheard enough of our private conversation to understand that I'd shared details about his behavior with someone outside our household. His anger at this perceived betrayal manifested in more overt threats and aggressive confrontations that abandoned any pretense of plausible deniability or reasonable interpretation. Derek cornered me in the laundry room on Tuesday morning, blocking the doorway with his body while describing what would happen to me if I continued discussing our family business with relatives who didn't understand the complexities of blended household dynamics. His voice remained calm and controlled, but his words painted vivid pictures of homelessness, financial ruin, and social isolation that would result from continued defiance of his authority and disruption of his relationship with my mother. The specific nature of these threats revealed how carefully Derek had been observing my vulnerabilities and dependencies, collecting information that could be weaponized against me if I attempted to resist his control or seek outside support. He knew exactly how much money I had in savings, which clients provided the majority of my income, where I would likely seek housing if forced to leave our home, and which relationships were most important to my emotional well-being and professional stability. This comprehensive understanding of my circumstances allowed Derek to craft threats that were both credible and devastatingly personal. He didn't need to threaten generic consequences. He could describe specific ways he would destroy the life I'd built for myself if I continued challenging his position as head of our household or questioning his treatment of me and my mother. When I attempted to discuss Derek's escalating threats with my mother, hoping that the explicit nature of his recent behavior would finally penetrate her denial and prompt her to take protective action, she responded with familiar patterns of minimization and blame redirection. She suggested that Derek's frustration was understandable, given my continued resistance to accepting him as a parental figure and authority figure within our family structure. My mother explained that Derek's investment in our household and his commitment to her happiness gave him legitimate rights to establish rules and expectations that I needed to respect, regardless of my personal preferences or emotional reactions. She framed his threats as passionate expressions of his desire to protect their relationship rather than abusive attempts to control and intimidate me into submission. This conversation marked the complete erosion of my relationship with my mother, and my understanding of her as someone who would prioritize my safety and well-being over her romantic partnership. She had chosen Derek's comfort and authority over her daughter's security, and no amount of evidence about his abusive behavior would convince her to reconsider that choice or acknowledge its devastating impact on my mental health and physical safety. The realization that my mother would not protect me and had become an active collaborator in Derek's campaign of psychological abuse forced me to confront the necessity of developing an independent safety plan that didn't rely on family support or intervention. I could no longer afford to hope that maternal instincts would eventually overcome romantic attachment, or that extended family pressure might influence my mother to reconsider her priorities and protective responsibilities. Research into domestic Abuse resources revealed that psychological and emotional abuse often escalate to physical violence when victims attempt to assert independence or seek outside support for their situations. The information I found suggested that my attempts to document Derek's behavior and seek validation from family members might actually increase my immediate danger by threatening his sense of control and dominance within our household dynamic. Professional. Counselors and domestic violence advocates recommended developing safety plans that included secure communication methods, emergency housing options, financial resources that couldn't be accessed or controlled by abusive partners, and documentation strategies that would provide evidence for law enforcement intervention if the situation progressed to criminal behavior. The process of creating a safety plan forced me to acknowledge how completely Derek had succeeded in isolating me from support systems and resources that could facilitate escape from his control. My financial independence had been compromised by his interference with my professional relationships. My social connections had been systematically damaged through his manipulation and my mother's compliance with his isolation tactics. Even my physical safety within our home had been eliminated through his escalating threats and intimidation. The most practical immediate step involved securing my important documents and valuables in locations where Derek couldn't access or destroy them if he decided to escalate from psychological abuse to property destruction or theft. I moved my passport, birth certificate, college transcripts, insurance papers, and backup copies of work files to a safety deposit box at a bank across town, ensuring that Derek couldn't eliminate my ability to establish new housing or employment if forced to leave our home suddenly. Creating secure communication channels became crucial as Derek's monitoring of my phone calls and internet activity intensified throughout September. He had installed tracking software on devices connected to our shared internet network, allowing him to review my email correspondence, social media activity, and search history for evidence of disloyalty or attempts to seek outside support for my situation. The discovery of this digital surveillance came when Derek confronted me about a Google search for domestic violence resources that I'd conducted late one night when I thought he and my mother were asleep. His knowledge of my private research activities confirmed that privacy no longer existed within our household, and that any attempts to seek help or gather information about my legal options would be immediately detected and punished. I purchased a prepaid phone with cash and created new email accounts using public computers at the library, establishing communication methods that Derek couldn't monitor or control. These covert channels allowed me to contact domestic violence hotlines, research legal options for protection orders, and maintain contact with Patricia and Rebecca without triggering immediate retaliation from Derek. The conversations with domestic violence advocates provided crucial information about the legal processes available for obtaining protection from psychological abuse and threats of violence. I learned that restraining orders could be issued based on documented patterns of intimidation and threat-making, even when physical assault hadn't yet occurred, and that courts recognized psychological abuse as a form of domestic violence deserving legal intervention and protection. However, the advocates also warned that obtaining legal protection against Derek would likely trigger significant escalation in his abusive behavior, particularly if he perceived the restraining order as a threat to his relationship with my mother or his residence in what he'd claimed as his territory. They stressed the importance of having comprehensive safety plans in place before initiating legal action, including emergency housing arrangements and financial resources that would allow me to survive potential retaliation. The prospect of leaving my childhood home and abandoning my mother to Derek's manipulation felt like failure and betrayal, even though I understood intellectually that I couldn't save someone who refused to recognize the need for rescue. The emotional attachment to my family and the hope that love and reason might eventually overcome Derek's influence kept me trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation longer than objective assessment of my circumstances warranted. October brought a series of incidents that demonstrated Derek's willingness to cross new boundaries in his campaign to eliminate my resistance and secure unchallenged authority within our household. He began entering my bedroom while I was sleeping, claiming to be checking for mechanical problems or security issues that required immediate attention regardless of the hour or my privacy expectations. These nocturnal intrusions were clearly designed to eliminate my sense of safety and privacy within the one space in our home where I'd previously felt protected from his surveillance and intimidation. The knowledge that Derek could access my bedroom at will, regardless of locks or privacy expectations, created constant anxiety that affected my sleep patterns and ability to rest or recover from the daily stress of living under his control. When I confronted Derek about these inappropriate invasions of my personal space, he responded with familiar gaslighting techniques, claiming that I was imagining these incidents or exaggerating normal household maintenance activities into evidence of persecution and harassment. He suggested that my paranoia about his presence in the house reflected mental health problems that required professional intervention rather than legitimate concerns about boundary violations and intimidation. My mother supported Derek's explanation by expressing concern about my sleep disturbances and anxiety symptoms, suggesting that stress might be causing me to misperceive normal activities as threatening or inappropriate. She recommended that I consider counseling or medication to address what she characterized as increasing paranoia and emotional instability, rather than acknowledging the reality of Derek's escalating boundary violations and intimidation tactics. The gaslighting reached new levels of sophistication as Derek began staging elaborate scenarios designed to make me appear mentally unstable when my mother was present to witness my reactions. He would hide my car keys and then express concern about my forgetfulness when I couldn't locate them for important appointments. He would change passwords for accounts I needed for work and then suggest that my memory problems indicated serious cognitive issues when I couldn't access essential services. These manufactured crises always resulted in my appearing confused, frustrated, or angry, while Derek maintained an appearance of calm reasonableness and concerned helpfulness. My mother would witness these interactions and conclude that Derek was being patient and supportive with someone whose mental health was clearly deteriorating, rather than recognizing the deliberate nature of the situations that created my distress and confusion. The pattern of staged incidents intensified throughout the fall, with Derek orchestrating daily scenarios that resulted in my appearing unstable, unreliable, or emotionally volatile to anyone who observed our interactions. He had mastered the art of provoking reactions that seemed disproportionate to their triggers, making my responses appear irrational while concealing the broader context of psychological abuse and manipulation that made those reactions entirely appropriate and self-protective. By November, I realized that Derek's campaign had progressed beyond simple control and intimidation to active preparation for either my voluntary departure or my involuntary removal from our household through interventions based on concerns about my mental stability and potential danger to myself or others. His documentation of my reactions to his abuse was being compiled as evidence that I required psychiatric evaluation and possibly residential treatment for conditions that existed only as responses to his systematic psychological warfare. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening in late November, when Derek's psychological warfare crossed into territory that even my denial-ridden mother couldn't rationalize as normal family conflict or misunderstood communication. The incident began as another manufactured crisis designed to provoke an emotional response that Derek could document and use as evidence of my alleged mental instability. But it escalated beyond his usual boundaries when alcohol amplified his aggression and eliminated his typical restraint. I had been working in my bedroom, preparing a presentation for a potential client who represented the largest contract opportunity of my freelance career. The project could have provided financial independence that would enable me to secure alternative housing and escape Derek's control, a possibility that threatened the foundation of his authority within our household. My focused attention on work that might facilitate my independence triggered Derek's need to disrupt my concentration and create chaos that would undermine my professional capabilities. Derek began by increasing the volume on the television in the living room directly below my bedroom, claiming he needed to hear the news despite the fact that my mother was trying to sleep in the adjacent bedroom. When I asked him to lower the volume so I could concentrate on deadline-sensitive work, he responded with lectures about my selfishness and inability to share common spaces respectfully with other family members who also had entertainment needs and preferences. The manufactured conflict escalated when Derek began playing music at volumes that made concentration impossible, alternating between genres and songs with jarring transitions designed to maximize disruption and frustration. When I closed my bedroom door to muffle the noise, Derek interpreted this as deliberate rudeness and disrespect that required immediate correction and punishment for my antisocial behavior and rejection of family interaction. Derek climbed the stairs and began pounding on my bedroom door with his fists, demanding that I open it immediately to discuss my attitude and behavior toward family members who were trying to include me in household activities. His voice carried an edge of violence that I'd never heard before, suggesting that his usual controlled intimidation was giving way to genuine rage that might manifest in physical assault if I continued to resist his demands for compliance and submission. When I refused to unlock my door, Derek's pounding intensified until the wooden frame began splintering under the force of his blows. He screamed threats about what would happen if I forced him to break down the door, describing specific acts of violence and destruction that left no doubt about his willingness to escalate from psychological abuse to physical assault if I continued to defy his authority and control within what he considered his domain. My mother appeared at the bottom of the stairs, awakened by the commotion, but instead of recognizing Derek's behavior as dangerous and inappropriate, she began pleading with me to open the door and apologize for whatever I'd done to upset him. Her response to his violent threats and property damage was to assume that I was somehow responsible for provoking his rage, and that my cooperation would diffuse the situation rather than reward his escalating aggression. The realization that my mother would prioritize Derek's emotional state over my physical safety, even when his violent intentions were undeniably clear, marked the final collapse of any hope that family loyalty or maternal instinct might eventually overcome her romantic attachment and denial. She had witnessed explicit threats of violence against her daughter and responded by demanding that the victim accommodate the aggressor rather than challenging his abusive behavior. Derek's assault on my bedroom door continued for nearly 30 minutes, with periodic pauses where he would describe in graphic detail what he intended to do to my belongings, my pets, and my body. Once he gained access to my private space, these threats weren't abstract warnings about potential consequences. They were specific promises of immediate violence that would result in permanent physical and emotional damage if I continued to resist his demands for submission. When Derek finally succeeded in splintering the doorframe enough to force entry into my bedroom, his physical presence filled the space with menace and the promise of violence that had been building throughout months of escalating psychological abuse. He stood in my doorway, breathing heavily from exertion and rage, surveying my private space with the expression of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey after an extended hunt. The violation of my final sanctuary within our home represented more than simple boundary crossing. It was a declaration that nowhere in the house would be safe from Derek's intrusion and control, that privacy and security were privileges he could revoke at will, and that my resistance to his authority would always result in escalating consequences until I submitted completely to his dominance. Derek's behavior in my bedroom that night crossed lines that transformed psychological abuse into criminal activity that could be prosecuted regardless of family relationships or housing arrangements. He systematically destroyed personal belongings that held sentimental value, including photographs of my father and artwork I'd created throughout my life, making clear that his violence was targeted at my identity and emotional well-being rather than random property damage. The destruction was methodical and calculated, designed to eliminate physical reminders of my life before Derek's arrival and my connections to relationships and experiences that predated his control. He threw my father's books into boxes, tore down posters and artwork that reflected my personality and interests, and scattered my professional materials across the floor while describing how my business would fail and my career would collapse. without his protection and guidance. Throughout this rampage, Derek maintained verbal contact with my mother downstairs, reporting on his discoveries of evidence that supposedly supported his claims about my mental instability and dangerous behavior. He described finding items and documents that he interpreted as proof of my paranoid delusions and inability to distinguish reality from fantasy, creating a narrative where his violence appeared justified as protective intervention rather than criminal assault and intimidation. When Derek discovered my journal documenting his abusive behavior, his rage intensified beyond anything I'd witnessed during our nearly 2 years of coexistence. The written evidence of his systematic psychological warfare represented an existential threat to his carefully constructed reputation as a concerned stepfather trying to help a troubled young woman manage her emotional and mental health challenges. Derek's reaction to reading detailed accounts of his threats, manipulation, and intimidation tactics revealed how conscious and deliberate his abusive behavior had always been. He wasn't surprised by the accuracy of my documentation, because he remembered every incident and strategy exactly as I'd recorded them, proving that his actions were calculated rather than impulsive, and that his gaslighting about my perceptions and memory was entirely fabricated. The journal also contained information about my research into domestic violence resources, legal options for protection orders, and safety planning strategies that threatened Derek's sense of security and control over the situation. The evidence that I'd been preparing to seek outside intervention and potentially legal protection represented a challenge to his authority that required immediate and decisive response to prevent my escape from his influence. Derek's destruction of the journal was thorough and deliberate, ensuring that months of carefully documented evidence would be eliminated before it could be used to support legal action or professional intervention. However, his focus on the physical journal reflected his ignorance about my digital backup systems and copies stored in locations he couldn't access or control. The violence that followed Derek's discovery of my documentation efforts crossed definitively into criminal territory that would support charges regardless of our family relationship or shared housing arrangement. His assault left visible marks that couldn't be explained as accidents or misunderstandings, and his explicit threats about future violence were witnessed by my mother, who finally seemed to understand that Derek's behavior had progressed beyond anything she could rationalize or excuse. When Derek finally left my destroyed bedroom, he paused in the doorway to deliver a final warning about the consequences of any attempt to report the evening's events to authorities or seek outside intervention for what he characterized as internal family discipline and necessary behavioral correction. His threats were specific enough to constitute criminal intimidation and clear enough to leave no doubt about his willingness to follow through on promises of escalating violence. My mother's response to witnessing the aftermath of Derek's rampage revealed the extent to which she had been psychologically manipulated and controlled throughout their relationship. Instead of recognizing his behavior as criminal assault that required immediate law enforcement intervention, she began cleaning up the destruction, while expressing concern about how the incident might affect Derek's emotional state and their relationship stability. Her priorities in the moments following Derek's violent attack centered on protecting his reputation and managing his stress, rather than ensuring my safety or addressing the criminal nature of his behavior. She asked me what I had done to provoke such an extreme reaction, suggesting that my actions were somehow responsible for Derek's choice to commit acts of violence and intimidation against a family member. The complete inversion of victim and perpetrator in my mother's understanding of the evening's events demonstrated how thoroughly Derek had succeeded in manipulating her perception of reality and moral responsibility. She had been conditioned to interpret his violence as justifiable response to provocation rather than criminal behavior that violated both legal boundaries and basic human dignity. That night, barricaded in what remained of my bedroom with furniture, pushed against the damaged door, I finally acknowledged that my mother would never protect me from Derek's abuse, and that hoping for family intervention was not only futile, but actively dangerous to my survival. The time for gradual escalation and careful documentation had ended. Derek's behavior now required immediate legal intervention and emergency protection that only law enforcement and the court system could provide. The decision to seek a restraining order wasn't motivated by revenge or dramatic gesture, but by recognition that Derek's violence would continue escalating until it resulted in serious physical harm or death if I didn't take decisive action to protect myself. The psychological abuse had been a systematic campaign designed to isolate me from support systems and break down my resistance to his control. But the physical violence represented an immediate threat that required emergency legal response. Using my secured phone and backup documentation stored outside our home, I began the process of seeking legal protection that would formally recognize Derek's behavior as criminal domestic violence deserving court intervention and official sanctions. The evidence I'd collected throughout months of psychological abuse would now serve as foundation for legal action that could potentially save my life and establish boundaries that Derek would be required to respect, regardless of his personal opinions about his authority within our household. The morning after Derek's violent assault, I left the house before dawn to begin the legal process of obtaining emergency protection from his escalating abuse. My backup documentation stored in the safety deposit box provided comprehensive evidence of Derek's systematic psychological warfare and intimidation tactics leading up to the previous night's criminal behavior, creating a timeline that demonstrated clear patterns of escalation rather than isolated incidents. The courthouse opened at 8, and I was among the first people in line to file for a temporary restraining order based on domestic violence and credible threats of future harm. The clerk who processed my initial paperwork recognized the urgency of my situation and expedited my case for same-day review by a judge who specialized in emergency protection orders for victims of family violence. Completing the legal forms required detailed descriptions of specific incidents that constituted evidence of abuse, threat-making, and intimidation worthy of court intervention. The process of translating months of psychological manipulation into legal terminology that would meet judicial standards for granting protective orders forced me to confront the full scope of Derek's campaign against my safety and autonomy within our household. The documentation I'd maintained throughout Derek's escalation proved invaluable in providing specific dates, times, and circumstances for incidents that might otherwise have been dismissed as vague complaints or personality conflicts. The judge reviewing my petition could see clear progression from subtle manipulation to explicit threats of violence, establishing a pattern that supported legal intervention rather than family counseling or voluntary conflict resolution. During the brief hearing to determine whether emergency protection was warranted, I testified about Derek's systematic isolation tactics, his threats about housing and financial security, his invasion of my bedroom and destruction of personal property, and his explicit promises of future violence if I continued to resist his authority or seek outside support for my situation. The judge's questions focused on the credibility and specificity of Derek's threats, the escalating nature of his behavior over time, and the likelihood that he would follow through on promises of violence if legal intervention didn't establish clear boundaries and consequences for continued abuse. My documentation provided concrete evidence that transformed my testimony from subjective complaints into objective proof of criminal behavior, deserving court protection. When the judge granted my emergency restraining order, effective immediately, and valid for 3 weeks pending a full hearing with Derek present to respond to the allegations against him, I experienced a mixture of relief and terror that reflected the reality of what legal protection would mean for my immediate safety and family relationships. The restraining order prohibited Derek from contacting me directly or indirectly, from coming within 500 feet of my person or workplace, from entering my residence, and from possessing firearms while the order remained in effect. These restrictions represented the first external validation that Derek's behavior constituted genuine threats deserving legal intervention rather than family conflicts requiring patience and understanding. However, the legal protection also meant that Derek would be served with papers that detailed my allegations against him and formally challenged his authority within what he considered his territory and domain. The restraining order represented an existential threat to Derek's control and reputation that would likely trigger immediate retaliation within whatever boundaries the law would allow. The most complicated aspect of the legal protection involved my residence in the same home where Derek lived with my mother, creating a situation where enforcing the restraining order would require either his departure or mine from the property where we'd both established legal residence. The court couldn't force Derek to leave a home where he had legitimate housing rights based solely on my allegations, but they could prohibit his presence if I was there first. Returning home that afternoon with legal documentation that redefined Derek as a criminal threat rather than a family member required careful planning to ensure my safety while collecting essential belongings and determining whether continued residence was possible given the restraining order's restrictions and Derek's likely response to being legally challenged. My mother's car was in the driveway when I arrived, but Derek's truck was absent, suggesting that he might not yet be aware of the legal action taken against him. The opportunity to speak with my mother privately about the restraining order and its implications for our household dynamics represented a final chance to determine whether she would prioritize my safety over her relationship with Derek. I found my mother in the kitchen, cleaning compulsively in a way that suggested she was processing stress and anxiety about the previous night's events and their potential consequences for her romantic relationship. Her immediate questions focused on where I'd been all day and whether I'd spoken to anyone about Derek's behavior, revealing her primary concern about reputation management rather than my well-being. When I explained that I'd obtained a restraining order based on Derek's violent threats and assault, my mother's reaction confirmed that she would continue prioritizing Derek's comfort and status over my legal right to protection from his abuse. She became immediately defensive about Derek's character and angry about my decision to involve law enforcement in what she characterized as private family business. My mother's response to the restraining order included familiar patterns of minimization, blame redirection, and reality distortion that had enabled Derek's abuse throughout their relationship. She claimed that I'd overreacted to normal family conflict, misinterpreted Derek's intentions, and damaged his reputation through false allegations that could affect his employment and social standing within our community. The conversation revealed that my mother had already begun constructing alternative narratives about the previous night's violence that absolved Derek of responsibility, while positioning me as an unstable young adult whose mental health problems had finally escalated, to making false accusations against innocent family members who'd tried to help and support me. When I showed my mother the physical evidence of Derek's assault, including bruises and scratches that clearly indicated his use of force during the bedroom invasion, she suggested that these injuries might have been self-inflicted or accidentally sustained during what she characterized as my own emotional breakdown and destructive behavior. This level of denial and reality distortion demonstrated that my mother had progressed beyond simple enabling of Derek's abuse into active participation in campaigns designed to discredit my testimony and undermine the legal protection I'd obtained. She was no longer a bystander to Derek's criminal behavior. She had become his accomplice in gaslighting and victim-blaming strategies. The depth of my mother's betrayal became clear when she informed me that Derek had already contacted his lawyer about responding to what he characterized as harassment through false restraining order allegations, and that they were prepared to challenge my credibility and mental stability if I pursued the matter through continued legal action. My mother's warning that Derek would fight the restraining order wasn't delivered as information I needed for my safety planning. It was presented as a threat designed to convince me to withdraw the legal protection before Derek suffered consequences for his abusive behavior. She wanted me to prioritize his reputation and her relationship stability over my physical safety and legal rights. The realization that both Derek and my mother were now united in opposition to my legal protection forced me to acknowledge that I no longer had any allies within my family system, and that my safety depended entirely on law enforcement and court intervention, rather than family support or protection. Derek's return home that evening before he'd been served with restraining order papers, created a dangerous situation where he was unaware of the legal restrictions on his behavior while I was present in violation of my own safety planning. His mood seemed unusually calm and controlled, suggesting that he'd spent the day planning his response to whatever action I might take regarding the previous night's violence. When Derek discovered that I'd returned home, he approached with familiar patterns of intimidation and threat-making that violated the restraining order before he'd even been formally notified of its existence. His immediate assumption was that I'd retreated in defeat and was prepared to accept his authority without further resistance or challenge to his dominance within our household. Derek's surprise at learning about the restraining order quickly transformed into rage that exceeded anything I'd witnessed during our previous confrontations. The legal challenge to his authority represented an unacceptable escalation that threatened not only his control over me, but his entire relationship with my mother and his residence in what he'd claimed as his territory. His threats about the consequences of involving law enforcement in family business were specific enough to constitute additional criminal intimidation that violated the restraining order's terms and provided grounds for his immediate arrest if I reported the contact to authorities. However, calling police would also escalate the conflict in ways that might result in violence before law enforcement could arrive and establish control over the situation. My mother's presence during Derek's reaction to the restraining order revealed her complete allegiance to his version of reality and her willingness to support his retaliation against my legal protection. She nodded agreement when he described the restraining order as evidence of my mental instability and vindicated his concerns about my need for psychiatric intervention and medication. The unified front presented by Derek and my mother in response to legal protection demonstrated that they viewed court intervention as an external threat to their household authority, rather than legitimate response to criminal behavior. They were prepared to challenge the restraining order through character assassination and alternative narratives that would discredit my testimony and establish Derek as the victim of false accusations. That evening, sleeping in my car in a parking lot across town while monitoring police scanner frequencies for any reports from my address, I understood that the restraining order was only the beginning of a legal battle that would determine whether Derek faced consequences for his abusive behavior or successfully portrayed himself as the victim of malicious prosecution. The 3-week period before the full hearing would be crucial in determining whether my documentation and testimony could withstand Derek's legal challenge and my mother's collaboration in discrediting my credibility and mental stability. The outcome would establish whether psychological abuse and threats of violence were recognized as legitimate grounds for legal protection or dismissed as personality conflicts requiring family therapy rather than court intervention. The 3 weeks leading up to the full restraining order, hearing became a period of intense legal preparation and psychological warfare as Derek and my mother worked systematically to undermine my credibility and build their defense against what they characterized as malicious prosecution based on false allegations and mental health delusions. Derek hired Timothy Walsh, a defense attorney with a reputation for aggressively challenging domestic violence allegations through character assassination and alternative narrative construction. Walsh's strategy focused on portraying Derek as a concerned stepfather trying to help a troubled young woman whose untreated mental illness had escalated to making dangerous false accusations against innocent family members who'd tried to provide support and guidance. The legal team's approach included gathering statements from neighbors, family members, and acquaintances who could testify about my alleged emotional instability, inappropriate reactions to normal family interactions, and concerning behavioral changes that suggested psychological problems requiring professional intervention rather than legal protection from abuse. My mother became Derek's primary character witness, providing detailed accounts of incidents where my behavior had seemed irrational, disproportionate, or disconnected from reality in ways that supported claims about my unreliable perception and tendency toward paranoid delusions about persecution and threats that existed only in my imagination. Her testimony described me as an increasingly isolated and angry young woman who resented Derek's presence in our family and had constructed elaborate fantasies about his behavior to justify my opposition to their relationship and my refusal to accept his legitimate authority as a parental figure within our household structure. The narrative my mother helped construct painted Derek as a patient and generous man who'd repeatedly tried to include me in family activities, offered helpful guidance about my career and personal choices, and attempted to address my behavioral problems through reasonable expectations and boundaries that any responsible adult would establish for dependent family members. According to their version of events, my documentation of Derek's behavior represented obsessive record-keeping that reflected paranoid thinking rather than legitimate safety planning, and my allegations of threats and intimidation were misinterpretations of normal communication filtered through mental illness and resentment about family changes I couldn't accept. However, Derek's legal strategy contained fatal flaws that his attorney either didn't recognize or chose to ignore in favor of dramatic courtroom theater designed to discredit my testimony through emotional manipulation rather than factual contradiction of documented evidence. The primary weakness in their defense was the extensive digital trail of Derek's abusive behavior that I'd preserved through backup systems he'd been unaware of during his destruction of my physical documentation. Screenshots of threatening text, messages, recordings of intimidating phone calls, and photographic evidence of property damage provided objective proof that contradicted their claims about my unreliable perceptions and false memories. Additionally, Derek's own response to the restraining order included behavior that validated my allegations about his intimidation tactics and disregard for legal boundaries. His attempts to contact me through intermediaries, his surveillance of my temporary housing, and his violations of the court's no-contact provisions created new evidence of the controlling and threatening behavior I'd described in my original petition. Patricia testified as a supporting witness about the dramatic changes she'd observed in my demeanor and living situation during Derek's residence in our home, providing external validation that my concerns about his behavior had been evident to family members who'd interacted with us during the relevant time period. Rebecca offered testimony about my consistent accounts of Derek's escalating abuse throughout the months leading up to the violent incident, establishing that my allegations weren't recently fabricated claims, but ongoing concerns I'd shared with trusted friends as the situation deteriorated. The domestic violence advocate who'd assisted with my safety planning testified about the typical patterns of psychological abuse and intimidation that matched Derek's documented behavior, providing professional context that helped the judge understand how individual incidents fit into broader campaigns of control and manipulation. The hearing itself revealed the stark contrast between Derek's carefully constructed public persona and the documented evidence of his private behavior toward me when no witnesses were present to observe his intimidation tactics and threats of violence. Derek's testimony presented him as a confused and hurt stepfather who'd tried his best to help a troubled young woman, but had been rewarded with false accusations that threatened his reputation, employment, and relationship with the woman he loved. His performance was polished and sympathetic, designed to generate judicial sympathy for his position as the alleged victim of malicious prosecution. However, when the judge questioned Derek about specific documented incidents, his responses became defensive and contradictory in ways that undermined his credibility and suggested that his public persona was carefully constructed rather than authentic representation of his character and behavior. Derek's inability to explain away digital evidence of his threatening communications, photographic documentation of property damage, and witness testimony about his intimidation tactics exposed the weakness of his defense strategy and validated my allegations about his systematic campaign of psychological abuse. My testimony focused on specific documented incidents rather than emotional appeals or character assessments, allowing the evidence to speak for itself while demonstrating that my perceptions and memories were accurate rather than distorted by mental illness or personal animosity. The judge's questions revealed his recognition that Derek's behavior fit established patterns of domestic abuse that courts regularly address through restraining orders, and that my documentation provided the kind of concrete evidence that distinguished legitimate protection needs from false allegations or personality conflicts. When the judge granted a permanent restraining order valid for 5 years, with provisions that prohibited Derek from contacting me directly or indirectly, required him to stay at least 1,000 feet away from my person and workplace, and mandated anger management counseling and domestic violence education programs, the legal validation of my experiences felt simultaneously vindicating and overwhelming. The court's recognition that Derek's behavior constituted criminal domestic violence deserving legal intervention represented the external validation I desperately needed during months of gaslighting and reality distortion designed to make me question my own perceptions and sanity. However, the legal victory also meant permanent estrangement from my mother, who viewed the restraining order as evidence of my betrayal and vindictiveness, rather than necessary protection from her boyfriend's abusive behavior. Her choice to prioritize Derek's comfort over my safety had created an irreparable breach in our relationship that no amount of time or explanation could heal. The months following the hearing brought unexpected peace and clarity as I established new living arrangements, rebuilt professional relationships that Derek had damaged through his interference, and reconnected with friends and family members who'd been systematically isolated from my life during his campaign of control. Living without constant vigilance and anxiety allowed me to recognize how completely Derek's psychological abuse had affected my mental health, sleep patterns, professional performance, and social relationships. The contrast between life under his control and life with legal protection revealed the full scope of damage that psychological abuse can inflict, even when it never escalates to physical violence. Derek's compliance with the restraining order was minimal and grudging, requiring multiple police interventions for violations that tested the boundaries of legal enforcement while avoiding behavior that would result in criminal charges. His efforts to circumvent the court's restrictions through intermediaries and indirect contact demonstrated his continued belief that legal intervention shouldn't supersede his authority over my life and choices. My mother's response to the restraining order included cutting off all contact with me and recruiting extended family members to pressure me into withdrawing the legal protection in the interest of family unity and Derek's reputation within our community. Her campaign to portray me as vindictive and mentally unstable continued long after the court had validated my need for protection. The experience taught me that family relationships aren't automatically deserving of loyalty when they become vehicles for abuse and control, and that protecting yourself from harm sometimes requires accepting permanent estrangement from people who prioritize comfort over safety. 2 years later, Derek and my mother's relationship ended when he redirected his abusive behavior toward her after losing his primary target for psychological manipulation and control. My mother's experience of being Derek's victim rather than his accomplice provided her with first-hand understanding of the behavior I'd documented and sought protection from, but her recognition came too late to repair our relationship. The restraining order remained in effect, providing legal protection that enabled me to rebuild my life without Derek's interference or intimidation. The court's validation that I hadn't been too sensitive, but appropriately protective of my safety and well-being became the foundation for trusting my instincts and recognizing red flags in future relationships. The journey from psychological abuse to legal protection taught me that sensitivity to manipulation and threats isn't a character flaw requiring correction. It's a survival skill that deserves validation rather than criticism. Sometimes the people who call you too sensitive are actually upset that you're sensitive enough to recognize their harmful behavior and strong enough to seek protection from it. The restraining order wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about establishing boundaries that protected my right to live without fear, intimidation, or psychological manipulation. The legal system's recognition that Derek's behavior warranted court intervention validated everything I'd experienced and documented during the darkest period of my life. Today, I understand that trusting your instincts about threatening behavior isn't being too sensitive. It's being appropriately responsive to genuine danger. The restraining order proved that my perceptions were accurate, my fears were justified, and my safety was worth protecting regardless of family opinion or social pressure to minimize abuse and maintain false peace. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.